Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. So, I've talked about this topic a few times on HBR, but I really need to tackle this one on my own here. This is a topic that is seriously very personal to me and impacts me, my career, and my potential future clients heavily. These are not things that I take lightly. And because half of the people on my friends list were sending this to me as though it's a wonderful thing and so relevant to my future interests in counseling, I just couldn't not say anything. And believe you me, there is so much to say that I can't even estimate how many videos it's going to take me for me to fully critique this garbage. I'm a little behind on this, I know, and I apologize for that. I've been busy with a lot to prepare for this month, as you probably expect, so hopefully I can be forgiven for being a little bit behind on this one. So let's get started. For the first time ever, APA is releasing guidelines to help psychologists work with men and boys.
Oh, goody.
At first blush, this may seem unnecessary. For decades, psychology focused on men, particularly white men, to the exclusion of all others. Okay, I'd like to know the decades in which psychology supposedly focused on men to the exclusion of everyone else. Let me provide a few examples of early psychological theories from a few of the early greats. Alfred Adler. Social interest and community feeling are probably Adler's most significant and distinctive concepts. Social interest includes striving for a better future for humanity. The socialization process, which begins in childhood, involves finding a place in society and acquiring a sense of belonging and of contributing. Social interest is taught, learned, and used. Adler equated social interest with a sense of identification and empathy with others, to see with the eyes of another, to hear with the ears of another, to feel with the heart of another. Individual psychology rests on a central belief that our happiness and success are largely related to this social connectedness. Those who lack this community feeling become discouraged and end up on the useless side of life. Adler noted that we are socially embedded and cannot be understood in isolation from the social context. We seek a place in the family and in society to fulfill basic needs for security, acceptance, and worthiness. Many of the problems we experience are related to the fear of not being accepted by the groups we value. If our sense of belonging is not fulfilled, anxiety is the result. Only when we feel united with others are we able to act with courage in facing and dealing with our problems. Carl Rogers. Rogers firmly maintains that people are trustworthy, resourceful, capable of self-understanding and self-direction, able to make constructive changes, and able to live effective and productive lives. When therapists are able to experience and communicate their realness, caring, and non-judgmental understanding, significant changes in the client are most likely to occur. Rogers expresses little sympathy for approaches based on the assumption that the individual cannot be trusted and instead needs to be directed, motivated, instructed, punished, rewarded, controlled, and managed by others who are in a superior and expert position. He maintains that 3 therapist attributes create a growth-promoting climate in which individuals can move forward and become what they are capable of becoming. 1. Congruence, genuineness or realness. 2. Unconditional positive regard, acceptance and caring, and 3, accurate empathetic understanding, an ability to deeply grasp the subjective world of another person. According to Rogers, if therapists communicate these attitudes, those being helped will become less defensive and more open to themselves and their world, and they will behave in pro-social and constructive ways. Albert Ellis. Rational emotive behavior therapy is based on the assumption that human beings are born with a potential for both rational or straight thinking and irrational or crooked thinking. People have predispositions for self-preservation, happiness, thinking and verbalizing, loving, communion with others, and growth and self-actualization. They also have propensities for self-destruction, avoidance of thought, procrastination, endless repetition of mistakes, superstition, intolerance, perfectionism and self-blame, and avoidance of actualizing growth potentials. Taking for granted that humans are fallible, rational emotive behavior therapy attempts to help them accept themselves as creatures who will continue to make mistakes, yet at the same time learn to live more at peace with themselves. Ellis assumes that we are self-talking, self-evaluating, and self-sustaining. We develop emotional and behavioral difficulties when we mistake simple preferences desires for love, approval, success, for dire needs. Ellis also affirms that we have an inborn tendency toward growth and actualization, yet we often sabotage our movement toward growth due to self-defeating patterns that we have learned. I don't know about you guys, but all of those examples seem pretty darn gender neutral to me. Let's move on. And men still dominate professionally and politically. As of 2018, 95.2% of chief operating officers at Fortune 500 companies were men. According to a 2017 analysis by Fortune, in 16 of the top companies, 80% of all high-ranking executives were male. Meanwhile, the 115th Congress, which began in 2017, was 81% male. First of all, this is a non sequitur. Putting aside the obvious fact that this is often the result of personal career and life choices that men and women make, the fact that men are more often in high-ranking positions means absolutely nothing with regards to their mental health or how their mental health ought to be handled. We see many wealthy celebrities that are miserable and commit suicide, and the careers with the highest suicide rates are often either well-paying, high-powered, or those unpleasant jobs that are more likely to be taken up by, you guessed it, men. Pretending like it's unnecessary to focus on men's mental health because they hold most of the high-powered careers is like saying it's unnecessary to focus on your car's engine because the tires do most of the hard work. It's stupid, short-sighted, and quite frankly should be seen as absolutely cruel by anyone with two brain cells to rub together. I mean, can you imagine someone telling you that focusing on your mental health seems unnecessary? What kind of a thing is that to say? But secondly, the reason that this is just a silly statement in general is because we have to keep the larger picture in mind. What percentage of all men are chief operating officers of Fortune 500 companies? What percentage of all men are high-ranking executives or Congress members? Now, on the flip side, what percentage of men work the dirty, underappreciated jobs? What percentage of men don't have jobs, period, or are homeless? Do we not care about the mental health of the 1,000 men in the ghetto just because of the 3 men who live in the downtown tower penthouses? That seems pretty ridiculous to me, but this blends nicely into their next paragraph. But something is amiss for men as well. Men commit 90% of homicides in the United States and represent 77% of all homicide victims. They're the demographic group most at risk of being victimized by violent crime. They are 3.5 times more likely than women to die by suicide, and their life expectancy is 4.9 years shorter than women's. Boys are far more likely to be diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder than girls, and they face harsher punishments in school, especially boys of color. Why, yes, it's almost like focusing exclusively on a group's most powerful members will lead you to miss some damning facts about the overall demographic's well-being, isn't it? I'm not exactly sure why they felt the need to bring up the bit at the end about the boys of color, though. Perhaps they just thought that if they tried climbing the oppression totem pole a little bit, they might be able to find more sympathy for the cause. APA's new guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men strive to recognize and address these problems in boys and men while remaining sensitive to the field's androcentric past. I'm not going to get into the meat of this one, because I basically already did, but I just want to point out the fact that they keep bringing this up as though it's an indisputable and obvious fact. They never explain how psychology is focused exclusively on men, or provide any examples. They just state this like it's plain to see, and people who don't know any better are going to be more likely to respond by saying, I never really thought about it that way, but I guess it must be true, rather than thinking critically about the statement and wondering, if mental health has been so heavily focused on men and boys, why are we only now coming up with guidelines on how to work with men and boys when a comparable guideline for women and girls we had 12 years earlier? Why, if mental health was focused so heavily on men, are men so much less likely to seek mental health help and so much more likely to commit suicide? And don't give me any of that toxic masculinity crap about how men are too afraid to address their feelings. If the social sciences were really such a boys' club, by men, for men, rah, 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 they would be more intuitive to men's needs and men's ways of relating and would have a better system in place for addressing those issues. But they don't. And this document just continues to demonstrate that the further on we go. 13 years in the making, they draw on more than 40 years of research showing that traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful and that socializing boys to suppress their emotions causes damage that echoes both inwardly and outwardly. And I'm sure this research is absolutely credible and focused on legitimate scientific criteria that can be proven through rigorous testing. I'm sure it contains a happy balance of research that demonstrates all of men's positive qualities in contrast to these supposedly negative traits, and isn't at all based on biased, unprovable concepts from trending social media or biased sociology textbooks. I'm sure this research is all done in perfectly good faith and isn't just yet another excuse to blame men for their problems or for tragic events committed by dangerous individuals that are not representative of 50% of the population any more than women who commit infanticide are representative of the respective members of their sex, right? Well, imagine my shock. APA's guidelines for psychological practice with girls and women were issued in 2007, and like the guidelines for men and boys, aim to help practitioners assist their patients despite social forces that can harm mental health. Many researchers who study femininity also work on masculinity. Several contributors to the guidelines for girls and women have also contributed to the new guidelines for boys and men. Coincidentally, this set of guidelines actually looks quite unlike the guidelines for men and boys. You see, I had a little look-see at the guidelines for psychological practice with girls and women, and I found a couple of distinct differences. Number 1, they're not blaming women for their own problems. They're not saying that there are traits inherent to the female sex that make them responsible for their own mental unwellness that we need to set about changing in them. Of course they're not saying that, because if we said that, everyone would have lost their damn minds. After all, it's terrible to tell people who are suffering that their problems are as a result of their own inherent characteristics, socialized, biological, or somewhere in between, because this doesn't provide people with any way forward. It doesn't give anyone any real direction on how to change their situation. It misses the point of what psychology is meant to be. A place for people to share their troubles and difficulties in life and to learn new strategies to deal with these problems in a way that makes their lives more manageable. So, if we suggested changes to women's behavior based on unhelpful stereotypes of the way that some women behave in some situations, of course, that's not going to accomplish much other than making the client feel inferior. It doesn't give them any path forward, no clear reason about how their behaviors might be negatively impacting their life, no concrete suggestions on how or why to change them and why such change would make a meaningful difference for them, or indeed, any real reason why it is these specific issues that are causing their problems in the first place, and no alternatives with which to replace these behaviors that would ostensibly offer a better outcome. Proceeding in this manner would be guidelines in the same way that telling a paraplegic that the reason they can't walk is because their legs don't work would be guidelines. Anyway, the second thing about this set of guidelines. Number 2, it basically goes in the direct opposite direction of the guidelines for men and blames literally everything else for their problems instead. Here are just a few examples. Stressors in the lives of women and girls include interpersonal victimization and violence, unrealistic media images of girls and women, discrimination and oppression, devaluation, limited economic resources, role overload, relationship disruptions, and work inequities. The abuse and violence in our society, e.g., abuse, battering, rape, may contribute to the development of dysfunctional behavior such as eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and suicidal behavior, while discrimination against women and girls of color can result in lowered self-expectations, anxiety, depression, and negative attitudes towards self. First, Females in the United States, on average, have less economic, political, and social power than males, and therefore have experiences that are more likely to contribute to issues of powerlessness. This is a problem in the opposite direction. As much as you don't want to put all the blame on an individual's stable personality traits for their poor mental health, you absolutely don't want to take all the power out of their hands either. I've talked about this multiple times before on this channel. By leading people to believe that their lives are out of their control, you're telling them either that they are powerless to change their situation, or that the amount of power they need to effectively change their situation is so great that it requires such immense effort to rally said requisite power to enact the necessary change that they are effectively powerless yet again. I mean, for goodness sake, this document literally says that. What kind of a message is that to send to vulnerable women? What kind of state is it going to leave them in if they eventually find that they do lack the power to remake society as they see fit? It doesn't give them the tools they need to make change in their life as it is now, which is, again, what psychology is supposed to be all about. Worse, it can lead them to see negative patterns and intentions in the rest of the world that generally wasn't originally there to begin with, which leads to the potential for increased anxiety, depression, anger, and general distrust of the world around them. Not exactly the picture of mental health, is it? Now, setting aside the normal critiques of victim fetishization comments like these, you can already begin to see that the nature of this document is dramatically different from the APA guidelines on men. Women are struggling because the world around them supposedly neglects and mistreats them, whereas men are struggling because masculinity leads them to behave in ways that are detrimental to their own mental health. It's a very different message, and I don't think that I need to explain the fact that the message towards men is neither a particularly kind or supportive one. Now, getting back to the men's guidelines, the last paragraph in this section has just one more point I'd like to focus on in this video. Though men benefit from patriarchy, they are also impinged upon by patriarchy, says Ronald F. Lavant, a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Akron and co-editor of the APA volume, The Psychology of Men and Masculinities. This drives me ape, I swear, every time I hear something like this. Somehow, they always manage to find a way to attribute hyper-agency to men and yet still blame men for all of their own problems anyway. Let's break this down. Patriarchy is a system imposed upon the world by men in which male power reigns supreme, and under which all others are subjugated or at very least lesser valued than the male counterpart. Yet, somehow, despite this system that supposedly puts all men above all others somehow at the same time impinges upon them, leading them, as this own document has attested, to commit suicide at far higher rates and die younger than women. Almost like this system doesn't really exist or something, huh? And on top of that, this system that supposedly privileges men at every turn has taken 12 years longer to put out a guideline for men and boys' needs than for women and girls, even though the field has supposedly been male-focused for nearly the entirety of its existence as a doctrine. This makes perfect sense. Whew. Good lord, I'm only just through the intro, and I've already had a massive rant on this. There's a reason that I'm calling this article my white whale. It single-handedly spits in the face of everything that I'm working to do, my career trajectory, in the clients I seek to help, in the field of psychology as a whole, and no doubt in society's trust in what was once considered a legitimate means of seeking help with one's problems. This document marks a major turning point for all of that, and it needs to be challenged as much as possible by as many people as possible. I'm sorry I'm a little late in putting out a statement on this, but having a newborn around does tend to slow down other projects a little. Yes, she arrived this month and has been doing well, if offering the standard problems that a newborn does bring. I'm planning to continue working through this document bit by bit in subsequent videos, offering thorough critiques on each section. There are other things that I'd like to be working on as well, but realistically, I have to stick with what I have time to do, so there you have it. So that being said, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.